Welcome back, life science learners, to our final segment today on homeostasis and coordination. Just a recap of what we've done. We've looked at the difference between the endocrine and the nervous system as two significant control systems in the body that maintain what we refer to as balance and equilibrium. Let's look at the concept of what negative feedback response is in this segment, and we'll try and apply our understanding to some different questions. So we ended off the last segment looking at negative feedback, and let's try and unpack that further to understand what is the mechanism in negative feedback. Okay, so the general sequence of events in a negative feedback mechanism involves the following 7 steps. So firstly, step 1, an imbalance is detected. That means there is a change, that is the stimulus. So go back to the 4 concepts. A stimulus is detected, and that's a change from the norm. So an imbalance is a change from the normal. The second step is that the control center is stimulated. So that's the response. A control center could be in the brain, it could be an endocrine gland like the pituitary gland. That is then stimulated. The third step would be that the control center responds to that stimulus. The control center will send out an effect. So we spoke about the effect now. The fourth step is that a message is sent to the target organ in the form of either a nerve impulse or an endocrine gland or an endocrine hormone. Step 5 would be that the target organ responds to that change. So we say that that's the effect that's going to happen. The response will happen from the effect. And then step 6 is it opposes or reverses the imbalance. The last step would be the balance is then restored. So essentially what happens is that the body will pick up a stimulus. That stimulus would be an imbalance that is detected. That imbalance is then going to be recognized by the control center as a change from the norm. The control center will then process that information, and it'll send an impulse to the effector organ, which could be a gland, a muscle, and that's going to then respond to the change from the normal by bringing about an opposite or reverse reaction so that the conditions can return back to balance or normal. And that's essentially the negative feedback loop. So negative meaning an opposite, and response meaning a message in that opposite manner. So negative, again, a change in the opposite, and response would be a message to that change. Right, so we also have mechanisms called positive feedback. So in a positive feedback loop, the feedback serves to intensify a response until the endpoint is reached. Essentially that means one stimulus having an effect on another, increasing the effect. And we'll look at an example of that in a bit. So examples of this control process, which is a positive feedback, would be blood clotting and childbirth. So during the process of childbirth, we have hormones that are produced, and those hormones will increase, which would assist the mother during the process of childbirth. So there's a positive stimulation, increasing the effect of a certain hormone to bring about a change. So let's unpack that process in this illustration. So when the head of the baby pushes against the cervix, a nerve impulse is sent to the brain. So that's the process when the baby's head pushes against the cervix. It sends impulses to the brain. The brain then recognizes that stimulus, and it uses the pituitary gland to release oxytocin. So oxytocin will then respond, and it'll increase in the bloodstream, and it'll then target the muscles in the uterus, causing the muscles to contract. So as the baby pushes further against the cervix, there is more stimulation of the nerve impulses to the brain. There is a greater release of oxytocin. There is an intensifying action on the muscles of the uterus, increasing contraction. And hence you would know from chatting to your parents or your siblings or people that have had babies, you would know that the intensity of the contraction increases And that's because as the process of the baby pushing against the cervix increases, there's greater positive stimulation, increasing the muscle contractions of the uterus because there's more oxytocin being released. So that is a positive feedback mechanism. Okay, so other examples of negative feedback mechanisms would be the regulation of thyroxine. Thyroxine is a hormone produced by the thyroid gland. So there are two glands that are responsible for thyroxine and maintaining metabolism. So the thyroid gland releases thyroxine, but it needs a stimulus. And that comes from gland 2, which is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland produces a hormone called TSH, which essentially stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. So this hormone stimulates the thyroid gland to produce more thyroxine. Now, let's look at this in an illustration on the next slide. So as I said, you have the pituitary gland that releases TSH. When there is less TSH, it sends out less thyroxine. So the thyroid gland produces less thyroxine because there is less TSH. This would mean that the thyroxine levels tend to decrease. And that will bring the thyroxine levels back to normal. When the thyroxine levels are too low, let's look at the next slide. So situation 2. When the thyroxine levels decrease below the normal limits, the pituitary gland is then stimulated to produce more TSH. The high TSH levels stimulate the thyroid gland to produce more thyroxine. So that's the positive feedback now. So we're seeing more TSH, more thyroxine, eventually resulting in the thyroxine levels increasing and coming back to normal. And that's illustrated in this flow chart. So when the thyroxine levels, we start here, decrease, the pituitary gland produces more TSH. More TSH goes to the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland releases more thyroxine, causing the thyroxine levels to increase. When the thyroxine levels increase, they come back to normal, thus maintaining the balance which we refer to as homeostasis. So guys, that's essentially how homeostasis occurs. However, homeostasis does fail, which means that sometimes there are certain abnormalities. And an example of that would be your blood pressure or your blood sugar levels. These often sometimes fluctuate and result in certain chronic or acute abnormalities. Let's look at some of these. So homeostasis mechanism works continuously to maintain a stable condition in the human body. Sometimes, however, the mechanisms fail. When they do, the homeostatic imbalance may result. So that means there's an imbalance in levels of hormones, in which cells may not get everything they need, or the toxic waste may accumulate. If homeostasis is not restored, the imbalance may lead to disease or even death. And a typical example of that is the process of maintaining a normal blood sugar level. And we know that if you have a diet that's excessively high in sugar, at some point as you age, you have an increased tendency to develop a condition known as diabetes mellitus. And that is essentially when homeostasis fails, because the body now cannot control the blood sugar levels. And that comes in with a whole lot of other complications. Okay, so that's essentially homeostasis failing and resulting in an example of that which we discuss now is diabetes. Okay, let's look at some questions where we can apply these concepts that we've just understood. So the first question: what are the 4 parts of a feedback loop? And this was the first slide that we discussed. And so I'm going to read through these options, and I invite you to work through these with me as we look at these various options. So A, the control center; B, action potential; and the third part of that would be hormone; and the fourth part, an effector. B gives you a sensor as being one part, the pituitary gland, the control center, and an activator. C, the stimulus, a sensor, a control center, and an effector. This seems to be the most correct option. Stimulus, effector, neurons, because those are in the nervous system, and the sensor. So if you look at all of the others, it's C. And the reason why it's C is because we know that it starts with the stimulus, you have a sensor that picks up the stimulus, you have a control center that processes that stimuli, and then an effector that brings about the change. So the correct answer there is C. The next question. Homeostasis in the human body is often maintained by, let's look at them. The neutral feedback loop, I haven't heard about this. The solar feedback loop, how enlightening, but certainly not correct. The positive feedback loop, or D, the negative feedback loop. And the question is often, and the question needs to be considered. So it's the negative feedback loop that is often used to maintain the homeostasis. Yes, the positive feedback loop does occasionally help, but it is the negative feedback loop that is most often used, and the emphasis is on the question and the word often. The cause for something to happen is again, is it the response? No, that's the change. The effect is the result. It's the stimulus, guys. So that is what causes something to happen. It's the stimulation, and that brings about homeostasis. So the correct answer here is C. So I'm going to skip through this, and I'd like to get through a question here that talks about the blood sugar levels. So we know that, you need to provide labels to the following. And this is essentially a slide that shows you the control of glucose levels in the body. So let's get onto that before we wrap up this section. So we have normal blood glucose levels that are maintained in the body. The scenarios are that, number one, the glucose level increases after a meal. The pancreas, an organ which picks up the stimulus, will need to release a hormone. And that hormone that it releases converts the glucose and stores it in the liver. So we know that the pancreas produces two hormones. The first hormone that it produces is called insulin. And insulin helps to convert the glucose and store that in the liver and muscles. So the glucose is converted into a complex form of sugar called glycogen. And glycogen is a complex carbohydrate which glucose is converted into. The glucose levels will then decrease because the glucose has been converted into glycogen. So there's a decrease in the glucose levels, returning the glucose back to normal. We also now have a situation where the glucose levels may decrease. And when they decrease, we know that this might happen when you've not had a meal, so it decreases, and you'll find that the body now relies on the stored glycogen. And so in order for that stored glycogen to be accessed, the pancreas will release a hormone called glucagon. And so the pancreas releases glucagon, and you've got the alpha and the beta cells that play an important role in this process. And that glucagon then will then be converted back into glucose, and the glucagon, is the hormone that helps to convert glycogen back into glucose. And so your glucose levels then increase, and bringing back the blood sugar levels back to normal. So we've unpacked these. So the first was insulin, as I mentioned. The second answer was glycogen. We said that it would decrease the levels, and then we noticed that when there was a decrease in sugar levels, the pancreas was going to produce glucagon, and glucagon was going to convert the stored glycogen back into glucose to bring it back to normal. So guys, we've unpacked the concept of homeostasis, and we've looked at how coordination happens between the nervous system and the endocrine system to maintain what we call balance. We also recognize that sometimes this balance can be disrupted, or we have imbalances, and these conditions could be because of abnormalities. We've unpacked one possible abnormality where we've discussed what happens with the pituitary gland and its hormones. We've also looked at what happens with diabetes and when the blood sugar levels change in the body. So guys, thank you for hanging in there. It's been a good session. I hope that you guys have enjoyed understanding homeostasis and coordination. I look forward to seeing you in our next session where we look at examples of how homeostasis is maintained in the body. From me, take care, go well, stay safe. Bye.